All right, everybody, welcome to week number 6 of From Exodus to Easter, otherwise known as It's the Last Week. It's been a fun journey. So today we finally are going to get to the Promised Land and get to that kind of final application about how Exodus can really point us to the Easter story during this season. Joining me back is Brandon Braun, who put all this together. And so if you've enjoyed this, he's the guy that is the one that's at the center of putting this together. And then also another face you're going to know, Bryce Osborne, one of our worship leaders here, big part of Happy Hour and SE Online, will be joining us. And we're going to have a discussion at the final phases of how the Israelites' story of going to the Promised Land really is something that can connect with all of us. So week number 6, the last one, starts right now. So we are wrapping up, and this is possibly out of all the weeks, the one that has the most content to cover in the least amount of time. So we are going to be flying, but it's going to be filled with application. And so we're going to start with the golden calf story, and we're going to end with the Promised Land. And we're going to fill in the blanks and miss a lot of details, but hopefully none of the heartbeat. So, Brandon, why don't you get us set with the golden calf? We ended last week talking about the 10 Commandments. We talked about the tabernacle, but the golden calf kind of intersects that point in time very well as well and takes us forward.
Yeah. So we're kind of starting in Exodus 32, but I want to back up and go back to Genesis 32 for just a minute. Because in Genesis 32, Jacob, who is Joseph's father, so going way back to the beginning of this, Jacob is on the banks of the Jabbok River. One of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's on the banks of the Jabbok River, and a man shows up in the middle of the night and just wrestles with him through the night. He and Jacob are fighting all through the night. And it gets to be morning, and you find out that this man is not just a man, that is God. And you find that out because he touches Jacob on the leg and dislocates his hip just to end the fight, to get it over. And at that moment, God blesses Jacob and says, your name is no longer going to be Jacob, the deceiver. Your name is going to be Israel. And your name means he wrestles with God, the one who wrestles with God. And it's interesting that as the people who grow out of Jacob's lineage, the Israelites, they take his second name, Israel. And so literally when you look at the Israelites, you're talking about the people who wrestle with God is what their name means. And that's really what we see in Exodus, starting in Exodus 32, is like these are people who are going to wrestle with God and with what he asked them to do. Because Moses is up on Mount Sinai. He's getting the 10 Commandments. He's getting this, hey, this is God going to be with us. And these are the instructions for the tabernacle and all this great stuff. And Moses comes down the mountain and they're worshiping a golden calf. Like before he can even show them the 10 Commandments, they've broken 2 of them. And they're worshiping this calf, and Moses is trying to figure out what's going on. And he goes to Aaron, and Aaron's like, well, the people made me do this. Basically, he's kind of passing the buck like Adam did in the beginning, and saying, well, they wanted this calf, so I did that. And you come to find out, they've made this calf out of the gold that they took from Egypt and things like the very things God wanted to bless them with. They used to melt down and make an idol for themselves. And so you see just very quickly in the story, like this is becoming, this relationship between God and his people is a little bit rocky. And it's a little bit rough that he has these expectations for them. He has these commandments for them, and they're right out of the gate. Just disobeying those things.
I find it interesting. I love that you did that. Brandon told me, he goes, I've got something I'm going to share at the beginning. I'm not going to tell you what. And so I've just learned this with you at the same time. He just was holding back. But the Exodus 32, Genesis 32, it's fun that it has the parallel in the numbers, which means nothing. But it's fun that it worked out that way. But when you think about that, Bryce, the idea of God's people being named people that wrestle with God, how do you see that coming out? Like, because that's so true, right? How do you see that in your life and the life of the people you know?
Oh, man. I mean, it comes back to when words are spoken over you, basically.
Yeah.
Right? That you become some of those things. It's almost like this prophecy. And it's cool that God knew that ahead of time of like, I know that it's not just a Jacob thing. I know this is the nation that is my chosen people. They're going to wrestle with me. And that's true for all of us because we're all, we get to see God in a different way now because we're not the nation of Israel, but we are his chosen people. It has bread and gone on. And I think that's pretty sweet that that's also our story. Like it's a constant wrestling with the Lord.
We're going to be wrestling with it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the other interesting thing, Brandon, I'm just thinking right now as you brought this up, it's interesting to me how much of my life is spent wrestling with it. And I think there's a big difference between, there's a couple of approaches of people with God where it applies to us today, right? Where you can wrestle with something, you can struggle through sin. You can struggle through, it's easy to see this in addictions, right? There's a big difference between wrestling with and then giving in. There's also a big difference between wrestling with and ignoring. And I think there's a beauty to the invitation of God to say, hey, you can wrestle with me.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it's in his book on prayer. Philip Yancey talks about that passage in Genesis 32 of like, this is a picture of prayer and just, you know, coming into our relationship with God. And hey, this is the struggle between what I want and then what you want, and me aligning myself with what you're asking of me. And I think that's a pretty good picture of how prayer sometimes feels.
Yeah, it's really good because I mean, you even look at you look at the very thing they turned sinful, which was a gift from the Lord. Yeah, and the fact that the Lord knows, like, hey, you're in a foreign land. Yeah. And you're going to be pulled in, right? You're going to be pulled into the ways of this world. You're going to want to use the things that I've given you, the good things that I've created for you, and you're going to be pulled into the ways of this world. You're going to wrestle with that, and it's because the place that you're at is really a messed up place. And so you're going to take some of the good things that I give you, and you're going to turn them into sinful things, unfortunately. The goodness of God is greater, so it's awesome.
Yeah, you know, the other interesting thing about this is there's this concept of wandering that results from this, right?
Yes,
so, you know, their disobedience leads to them not going. And I think you put in the notes, right, that the trip from Egypt to the Promised Land could be done in 11 days, right? Like that's how long it could have taken. But they spend 40 years wandering around in disobedience. Not all of it, but in parts of it. And it's definitely due to their disobedience within all of that. But I love the picture of this because I think this is the beautiful picture of what the gospel still is, which is that we are in a state of wandering, being led to a promised land that will come upon our death, right? Like that's the word picture with this. But as we dial into the post kind of golden calf story and we move into those wandering years, what is it that sticks out to you, Brandon, with that as we think through the story of things that we should be thinking about as we read through this large section of Scripture?
You know, I think it's interesting when you look at the reasons why they wander, because earlier in Exodus, like I think it's Exodus 13:17, is it says, well, God was leading them on this roundabout road to get them ready because they weren't ready to go to battle. But then you get to Numbers 13, which I guess is that chapter alignment again. In Numbers 13 is where you have the story of the 12 spies. That's kind of God's final straw with them of, you know, the 12 spies go out to Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good.
Which is a great VBS song that Brandon doesn't want to sing.
No, you could, if you want to go with
what
it,
is
though.
that song?
You don't know this? You have to look at that up.
We'll have to look it up.
So 12 spies go into the Promised Land.
12 spies go check out the Promised Land.
10 were bad and 2 were good.
Yeah, 10 come back and say, there are giants in the land, we can't take it. And 2, Joshua and Caleb, they come back and say, no, God is going to give us this land. Like, we don't care what's there. We can go take it. But the Israelites side with the 10 spies who have no faith. And so as a result, God says, well, you're going to wander the desert for 40 years as we wait for this disobedient generation to die off. Which I kind of wonder, like I've always as you got to the end of the 40 years, and you know, like Frank's the last person left.
Yeah.
Like,
come on, buddy.
If you could just go, like we go to the Promised Land.
Take one for the team.
We all do feel bad for Frank.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The Israelite Frank.
Yeah.
So, you know, but they're kind of condemned to this wandering for 40 years of their own disobedience. And so earlier they were wandering because God was getting them ready. And they wander for longer than they should have because of their own disobedience. And I think there are just those times where, you know, we have to look at our own lives and wonder, you know, do I feel like I'm wandering now because God's getting me ready for something? Or am I wandering because, you know, maybe I'm just not living in obedience in some way?
I think, too, the application, that's so easy because there are so many times we know the thing we're supposed to do. We know the next step we've been called to do. The question is, am I willing to be obedient to that thing that seems like I know I should do it, but then when I look into it a bit more, it seems impossible. Yeah. And And within our own hearts, as we spy into that next step, it's hard to trust that. And there's a lot of opportunity to off-ramp from that. And then we can't figure out why nothing's working out. How have you seen that kind of concept play out in the wandering and the waiting just personally?
I legit coming to staff here at Southeast was one of those for me.
Okay.
Whenever I'd stepped away from the church that I was serving at and helped plant for a while, I remember telling God, like, because I was in transition from there to here, and I remember telling the Lord, like, man, it'd be nice if I just had like a month to just rest and kind of replenish and fill up before I started, a new ministry and started tackling, full guns blazing after it. And I didn't realize that God knew better, and it was going to be 4 months.
Okay.
And so it went from me being like, oh man, 1 month would be great and very restful, to then going 2 months, and I was like,
this isn't what I had
this
planned.
is not what I was thinking. Then 3 months went by, then 4. And, looking back on it now, like, then I wouldn't have said it. Then I would have probably been a little bit like, God, what are you doing? Like, are you going to come through? But now in hindsight, I can look back and see how God was not just prepping ground here, but God was prepping ground in me. And there were things that I hadn't dealt with that I needed to do spiritually as a leader, and all kinds of things within my heart that God was preparing me for, readying me for in all aspects. Very vague, but very all aspects of my life, and even here too.
One of the jokes Beth and I make when things aren't going our way on something, like when something's just not working out, whatever it could be. It could be as simple as, like, even recently we had a piece of tire rubber from a semi tread, get on our car, and we had to get it fixed. And, just the little things that happen. I'll joke with her going, well, I guess God knew we couldn't handle that. Like, meaning like we need to be humbled a bit more. I'm like, that's you. We'll joke with each other about that. But I do think there's a healthiness to that we bring that up of going, when things happen, of going, okay, we've been prepared for this moment. We need to embrace and live in it. It's really hard to do that, though.
So hard.
Oh, yeah. But the great thing is, I think, and Bryce, you're kind of hitting at this too, is when we look back on those times, that regardless of why we were wandering, God's timing always works out.
Yeah.
Oh my,
He's always working his plan and making those things happen. I think about the times that I've wandered in my life or felt like I was spinning my wheels, and it was always, now you look back and you see, oh, well, that's what God was doing there. My wife and I, we went through 5 years of not being able to have children. And then you look back on that and it's like, oh, well, now we have 4. But God knew the timing of that.
Sure.
And, I wouldn't have the 4 kids that I have if it wouldn't have been for that timing. You think about situations in ministry, or, where you're looking like, okay, I feel like it's time to move on, and you're waiting. And then you look at, like, I think of my ministry previous to Southeast, like I was looking to go somewhere else for a while. And then when that door finally opened for me to come back to Louisville, it was like, oh, this is what God was doing in that time when I was waiting, And I think there's just something about God's timing that when we get to the other side of that waiting and wondering, we see it. And it's like, oh, that's what he was doing there.
Yeah, it's interesting, even I've said this before, but even if, like, I would have had the job I'm in right now 5 years sooner, I would have been fine skill-wise. Like, I had those skills, but I would not have been fine in maturation. And some of this room would debate I wasn't. They're still not. But my point is, you can see where, like, well, wow, I'm glad that happened when it did. And hindsight is the preparation for that.
Can I share another one?
Sure.
I just thought of this, and it really, it hit home for me as you're sharing that. Whenever Amelia and I had moved here, we really wanted to buy a house, and I think this is a really practical, example. We really wanted to buy this house, and or just a house, and so we were looking and looking. We were in this apartment, and in our mind, we had given us a goal, like, yeah, we'd like to be out of the apartment in a house within 2 years, and so we just prayed about it. God, just like however long, whatever house, like we'd looked at 1,000 houses, went and viewed them, and we'd walked in like, oh man, we love this one, and wanted to make an offer, and always there was this little sense that it just wasn't time. And what was kind of crazy is the more we prayed about it, the more time we spent with the Lord in it, in this waiting period, you start inching up on the 2-year mark, and you're like, this is not going along our plan. But what was really interesting is we had met some neighbors that was right beneath us in the apartment that we had really no idea that, like, that was the whole reason we were there. It was not for us to live there. The whole reason for us to be there was because we had some neighbors that God wanted us to love on and show Jesus to. And what was really wild is we began to realize in our prayer life, like, I don't think God wants us to buy a home until they know who Jesus really is. And I kid you not, one of the last things this couple, and the last time we had dinner together, the man, he actually at dinner kind of came up to me and says, "Hey, dude, I can tell you're weary and you're tired." He goes, "You mind if I pray over you?" And he circled me and Amelia up and prayed over us. And then he told us, like, "Hey, like we're actually moving to Georgia. I just wanted you guys to know this." And so literally he moves to Georgia, and we buy a house at the exact same time. And we were like, "Oh, God was right the whole time." He kind of let us in on this, like, "Hey, you're going to stay there as long as they're there."
It's fun when that happens like that.
It's so cool.
It is.
In the moment, we were frustrated.
Yeah.
Now we're like, "God, you are so good and faithful." So sometimes the waiting is preparing us.
Yeah.
Sometimes God just wants to use you where you're at.
Yeah.
So when we dive back to the story, Brandon, their disobedience.
derail.
No, you're good.
No, that's great.
The derail is what's helpful. But in the story of the Israelites, they're now wandering for 40 years. They're waiting on Frank to die. What is it you think about is most significant during the 40 years that that we should know?
I think it's ultimately just kind of sad that even in the midst of their wandering, Moses gets caught up in disobedience, right? That Moses himself is counted among the disobedient generation, because at one point God tells him, just tap this rock, or just touch the rock and water will come forth from it. And Moses is so frustrated at that moment that he strikes the rock and hits it. And there's just something there where God's like, "Well, no, Moses, now you're not going to enter the land." And it's kind of funny that when you get to Deuteronomy, like Deuteronomy is the record of Moses' final speech to the Israelites. There are multiple times in Deuteronomy where Moses says, "And I can't enter the promised land because of you guys." And so Moses eventually he goes up on I think it's Mount Nebo where he passes away. It says he's buried by God. As this servant of God. Yeah, it was an incredible picture of God's concern and love for Moses. But I just think, it's sad to think that even Moses and Aaron and Miriam and these people who led the Israelites out in the Exodus and saw these great things, they get caught up in these years of wandering.
And it's interesting, too, that Moses got to experience the presence of God. He got to see the promised land.
Yeah.
He got to experience the works of God, and yet he still wrestled with trusting God.
Yes.
And I find that somewhat calming when I struggle through that myself. I don't know if that does you as well with that. You have something you want to add to it, Bryce?
I was reading a scripture earlier this morning, and it's funny that you mentioned the rock piece, because Apostle Paul, I can't remember if it was Corinthians or, he's thought to have maybe written Hebrews. I can't remember if it was Corinthians or in Hebrews, but where Paul would literally say, the rock that was with you that brought you water was actually Jesus himself.
Yes, yeah.
And so when you think of the connotation of him, I need to scoot a little closer to the mic. When you think of him being striking the rock, like that's literally like the Son of God. Like he's actually that's how frustrated he was. I thought it was interesting as I read that this morning, and you mentioned that.
Oh, that is interesting.
That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Side thought.
That's a great sidebar. So eventually we get to a new leader in Joshua. So Brandon, why don't you set us up with how Joshua comes to be, and let's talk about moving into the promised land, what that could look like, and then let's back out and kind of talk about our title of the whole thing, Exodus to Easter, and how this applies.
Yeah. So Moses dies on Mount Nebo, and so the leadership of the Israelite people now turns over to Joshua. And the interesting thing for us, from a Christ perspective, from our perspective as New Testament believers, is that Joshua is the Hebrew name Yeshua, which is also Jesus.
Yeah.
So
Joshua is the Hebrew name of Jesus.
Yeah. So you look at what Moses couldn't do, Yeshua does, and it's that's going to be significant later. So
and what the law failed to do,
yes, Jesus does. Exactly. Like Paul makes that argument pretty extensively in Romans, right? Yeah. Jesus does what the law of Moses couldn't do. And so it falls to Joshua, who's one of the two good spies. He's still alive. And God calls him to go and lead the people into the promised land. And the promise that is given to Joshua to help kind of spur him along in this, because I imagine it's got to be overwhelming, right? To walk into that space and think, well, Moses has led us for 4 decades.
Now it's me.
Yeah, now, like I'm not Moses.
Oh.
And so God appears to Joshua and gives him this great promise, and it's Joshua 1:6-9, which is, the be strong and courageous, for you're the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. And it comes down to the end of verse 9. And the reason he's supposed to be strong and courageous is that the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That God is just telling Joshua, like, I'm going with you. Now, like, we're going to go, I want to say we're going to go do this together, but it's not even really that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to go do this for you.
Yeah.
You're just going to lead them after me. Yeah.
Yeah, you just follow, and I'll take care of the rest.
Yeah.
And that's what we see through Joshua's conquest, like the Battle of Jericho and the parting of the Jordan River. God is always moving ahead of them.
Yeah.
And doing some great things.
I love that line that you said, because it's such an important thing that we remember, that it is that Yeshua does what Moses couldn't do, that Jesus has done what this was powerless to do. And then the same is true with us. What we are powerless to do on our own, to even be the people we want to be, is only possible through knowing Christ and following his ways, and stepping into that. And I think that that's such a true statement that I think matters for. What are you thinking about as you process through kind of this leading into the promised land portion?
Oh man, I think of how intimidating it'd be for Joshua, honestly, to fill those shoes of Moses, like you talked about. I even think of him, as he's prepping to cross the Jordan into the promised land. I put myself in his shoes thinking, like, man, I hope God shows up the same way he did with Moses in a moment. Like, maybe if I just go out there and raise my staff, then it'll all part. But it actually was different, right? Like,
right, yeah.
Whenever the water, it actually slows down. So it happened, like, it got clogged up way down the river, like, had no idea, and they just see it slowly start to happen. So I'm sure, like, if I'm Joshua thinking, hey, I'm going into all that God's promised, I'm leading the people, trying to honor the Lord, trying to be faithful, trying to hold on to that promise that he's with me, be strong and courageous. I'd probably try to do the exact same thing my previous leader did, like, hoping it works.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes where the Israelites tried to do what used to work and it didn't work because God wasn't in it. But instead, Joshua was faithful to what God said. It wasn't the same as Moses. It was actually different. And it actually took a lot more faith, I believe, because he had to hope and believe that the water was being slowed where he couldn't see.
Yeah.
That was pretty interesting.
One of the things, I was literally talking to someone yesterday that was going through a very insanely difficult time. Unpredictable moment happens. Family just, like, very, very quickly, rapidly, things fall apart out of nowhere situation. And I was caught off guard by the whole thing. And one of the things I told him on the phone last night at the end of our conversation is, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. But what I want you to know is you are going to be okay. Like, you're going to be okay. You're not alone in this, Like, there's a lot of people in your life, but also, like, God's not abandoned you in this. It may feel like it, but you are going to be fine. If it goes to the left or if it goes to the right, we don't know. But either of those, you're fine. And I think that's one of those things you can take away from this with the be strong piece, is that God is with you in the good times, but he's also with you in the bad times, and that you can trust that you're going to go to the promised land. We're still wandering, and I think sometimes we think right now we should be crossing the river, and that's not what's happened. God's gone to prepare a place for us, and we have to trust that he's done that, and that it's worth it, and that we're still wandering.
Well, even, going back into Exodus, there was a time where God kind of told the Israelites to go ahead and move from a place, and Moses stopped God and said, well, no, if you're not going to go with us, then don't send us. Don't let us go anywhere without you. I think Exodus 33, and he has this phrase in there, for your presence among us sets your people and me apart from all the other nations on the earth. Like, we can't go where you're not, because you are our defining mark. And we see that, finally in the book of Joshua, that God is ready to give them this land. So he's going with them. And so Joshua, is just taking that promise of God's presence and saying, we're going to finally gain hold of this land and this home that you promised us.
Yeah. And I think to land our story today is that God is fulfilling what he promised long before, that they're going to be at home in this new place, and they're going to enter it in to that. I'd like to talk about the fact we've called this From Exodus to Easter intentionally, because in the next days, you're going to be sharing the Easter story again. At whatever church you're going to, with SE Online, obviously, it's going to be all about Easter. You're going to learn. We're going to be talking a lot about baptism and a lot of these imagery that come true in the Easter story of Jesus coming back to life.
Right.
How do you see this right now? What are some parting words in the story of Exodus that we can have that point us to what Easter is all about? Like, how do you see that coming true in this story as we kind of bring it to a conclusion?
You know, kind of sticking with some of what we talked about today, I think of the already but not yet nature of so much of the Israelites' journey, you know, is as they were spending 40 years wandering and as they've come out of this land of their slavery, there are things that are already theirs. Like, you know, we don't belong to Egypt anymore.
Yeah. They're already free from that.
Yeah, we're free from oppression. We're free from our bondage. But they don't yet have what God has promised to them. You know, they don't have the fullness of it in the promised land. And I think that's exactly the experience we're in, you know, as New Testament believers, is we already have.
And how does Paul write about it? It's a dim reflection, right?
Yes.
Right now, it's a dim reflection. It's a dingy mirror of what is to come. It's a Polaroid picture that hasn't shaken all the way out yet.
Right.
That's what the already is. And the not yet to come is
The perfect complete.
the completeness of that.
Yes, yeah, and so we just live in this reality of like we are no longer slaves. We are no longer in bondage. We no longer live according to the rules of Egypt, you know, but we're not yet home.
Yeah.
And we're still wandering, and we're still searching, and we're looking for that home that's been promised to us. And you know,
I want to pause.
Yeah.
That home is not here.
Right.
That home is something he's gone ahead to prepare. And I think we get confused thinking this is the promised land.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I read in the midst of my study through Exodus, I think it was Tim Chester had this quote where he said, the Bible is the story of God bringing us home. And he used that with Exodus and saying, well, God, this is the story of God bringing the Israelites home. And I thought, well, that's just, I mean, that's ultimately our stories too.
Yeah.
Is that this is how God is bringing me home.
And that's the story of Easter is Jesus making it where we can go home.
Yes.
And bringing that completing act to it. What do you say on this when you think about kind of this final movement here, preparing for Easter?
It's a hard mind shift, you know, to look at what you see that seems so permanent and to actually trust and try to believe this isn't it, right? Like, because all we know is what's tangible to us, but the whole gospel story has been a promise of something greater yet unseen, and that's what faith is. And so, you know, I think of, in Hebrews, you know, I think of kind of these closing words that, you know, maybe Paul, maybe whoever wrote. He says this, he says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So do not be attracted by strange new ideas. Your strength comes from God's grace, not from rules about food and regulation, which don't help those who follow them. He says, we have an altar now from which the priest in the tabernacle have no right to. Under the old system, under the old law, the high priest brought the blood of animals into a holy place as a sacrifice for sin, and the bodies of animals were burned outside the camp. He says, so also Jesus then suffered and died outside the city gates to make his people holy permanently by means of his own blood. So let us then go out to him. It says, for this world is not our permanent home. We are looking forward to a home yet to come. And he says, so therefore, since all that's true, let us offer through Jesus a continual sacrifice, not for the forgiveness of our sin, but let's worship and praise God. Let's proclaim our allegiance to him and not forget to do good and to share with those in need. These are the sacrifices that are now pleasing to God. And I think that's interesting, you know, that he's going, hey, I've done all of that. So in the meantime, until you're home with me, just do good to one another.
The sacrifice that you
one
make
another.
is to be overly concerned with the other. And I think that that's a beautiful picture of the love that Jesus lived with, brings, and that when you embody and you take the fullest of what he's trying to convey here to God's heart, it's love. I think that's one of the interesting things that when John is writing the book of John and things when he's much older than everyone else, and he was a teenager when he knew Jesus. And one of the things I find interesting when he's going, you know, he surely had read the other writings that the other New Testament authors had written, and then finally he's filling in the gaps. And John's kind of a weird gospel. It's different than the other ones. And the thing he conveys in everything he writes is, I think the thing I want you to know is that he's love. Like the thing I remember most about Jesus is the way, like, is the word love. And you see that come out time and time again. It's a very emotional text.
Yeah, well, and you even think in John's gospel how does he identify himself when he talks about himself
Yeah.
in the
The one who
gospel?
Jesus loved.
Yeah, the one who Jesus loved. I'm not John. I'm not the disciple. I'm the one who Jesus loved.
And that is available to all of us. And the story of Exodus beautifully points out that he is going to lead us to a promised land. He's going to lead us to our home, and we can trust that, and that Jesus is the better Moses, and he is there to do the same for us today. All right, it has been awesome for all of you joining in. And I got the author of From Exodus to Easter right here joining me.
Well, I mean, it's true.
It's true. So Brandon, looking back at the discussion you were a part of, what is it you were thinking about?
I just like the idea of talking about the promised land in terms of the presence of God, that this is where God is. And I think so often when we talk about heaven, we talk about things like the streets made out of gold and the gems and all of those things.
Yep.
But really, at the end of the day,
It's
like,
life.
what makes the promised land the promised land? What makes heaven heaven? Is God is there.
Well, and that's where we get it wrong here, because we have a lot of pictures of what heaven will be like, right? And we can get lost at thinking heaven is something that it's not. But at the end of the day, it's going to be that relationship with God. What are we going to be talking about in group time during this week as well?
We're going to be talking about some of the wanderings, some of the things that go on as Israel's waiting to go to the promised land, and then ultimately what our hope looks like as we wait for Jesus to take us home.
Awesome. Guys, thank you for being a part of this. If you've not caught it all, go check out the other episodes with this. But thank you for being a part of From Exodus to Easter.